We've given it a few extra minutes there. Um, so I've changed the title. Uh, I might have copied one of the chairs. I'm not sure, but um, we're going to call it the Research Ethics Board Review Tips and Tricks. I've sort of jettisoned a lot of the information we've shared in prior years and tried to focus on sort of common things we see that come up all the time. For anyone who doesn't know me, I forgot to put my Gogo in there, but it's Rashmi Pandya. Everyone calls me Gogo. I am the compliance specialist, human research. My background is in philosophy and ethics in particular. Um, I put my name twice is what's going on here. You can tell this was done a little, I was revamping late in the game. So apologies. So just a few things on what we're going to discuss today. We are going to I'm actually not going to go into detail on this because I tend to go on and then the whole hour is through. But I am just going to provide some examples of unethical research. I really strongly recommend people take a look if you're not familiar with some of these cases, as it does provide context for some of the requirements that you'll see when you submit applications. Um, we're going to go through the guidelines that REBs in Canada follow and some international guidelines. We'll go from your proposal, whether it's a grant proposal or you've sort of started off with that rough draft of what the study will be, to the submission process of the REB application. And we'll discuss the REB review process and timelines. And then we're going to have some final tips and takeaways. And we have a guest speaker, Dr. Cassandra Osag. Um, Cassandra is in the Department of Sociology and Social Studies, and she actually was on the REB prior, so she is going to be speaking though today as a researcher and just providing her perspective on what that process looked like when she had to go through it. Um, so, you know, when people think of the REB, I think this comic sort of summarizes what their perspective is. They go in with one idea and they come out and it looks very different to what they started with. Um, Hopefully, the information you get today will provide information so that when you start, the study is pretty well, ready to start as soon as you get that approval, and we can speed up the review process if everything's in place. Um, we're going to just talk a little bit, as I said, some examples on why REB review is required for funded or unfunded research involving humans in Canada, and in most places in the world right now. Um, there's a whole history of notorious research with human participants. Probably one of the key North American examples, but also one of the examples that really um, made it clear that there needed to be some sort of institutional review process guidelines in place, um, was the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis. Um, just a few things about that. It was a vulnerable population, very marginalized, disenfranchised population. Um, there was no informed consent, and in fact, deception was used to keep people in the study, even when um, a relatively simple and straightforward cure for syphilis was discovered. Um, People were kept in the study, and essentially, you know, people died terrible deaths from it. Families were affected. Um, and generally, when a whistleblower brought it to the attention of the media, it really put in the public eye the need for oversight of research with humans. Um, There's also the case of Henrietta Lacks. I'm not sure if people have heard about this. She was a cancer patient at Johns Hopkins University Hospital. Um, uh, from a biopsy of one of her tumors, a sample was taken and was used for research. And out of that came the HeLa cell line, which is still being used today in cancer research. The university and other organizations have profited from the unauthorized use of Mrs. Lack's biological sample. There's all kinds of issues here of not having consent and the family members not being notified. Um, so very problematic case. Closer to home, we have the nutritional research on residential school children in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. Um, you know, this research, it's appalling. You should take a look at it. I won't go into the details of it, but um, you know, really no informed consent whatsoever, certainly no parental or guardian consent, withholding basic health things such as dental care from children, and some questionable interventions that really did not seem geared towards improving a nutritional deficit in the residential schools. Um, there's also a couple of other cases, one in Arizona with the Havasupai people, uh, and they invited, researchers in from Arizona State University to study the high rate of diabetes in their people. The researchers ended up using the samples to study tribal schizophrenia, population genetics, and migration patterns, really stigmatizing um, those people. In a similar vein, the new Newt of BC had asked a University of British Columbia researcher to study the genetic basis of arthritis and related diseases that were plaguing their community. The researchers shared the samples for research with, I think it's by the end, it was something like 100 different researchers from all over for research on HIV/AIDS, population genetics, and evolutionary history. More in a behavioral vein, there was the Stanford prison experiments, and if you want to see a really interesting case that kind of crosses the biomedical and behavioral divide, you might want to look into a case closer to home, the case of David Reimer. Um, it deals with some interesting sort of perceptions on um, something that's quite at the forefront of discussion today, which is, um, gender differences. So take a look if you want to sort of understand the context for why research ethics board review is a requirement in most countries. Some of the international and national ethical standards that assure ethical research with human participants are the Nuremberg Code, which came out of um, the what's called the doctor trials after the Second World War, when it was discovered the doctors in concentration camps were doing research on prisoners. Some highly, highly problematic research from an ethical perspective. Not to mention that there certainly wasn't consent. Um, the Nuremberg Code is a code of 10 sort of basic ethical principles. From that came the Declaration of Helsinki, and it's gone through a few ratifications over the years and is updated on a regular basis. Post the Tuskegee syphilis study, sort of, hitting the media and a call for changes to how human research was done in North America. The Belmont Report was commissioned and created that outlined uh, guidelines for both biomedical and behavioral human research. And in Canada, we have the Tri-Council Policy Statement for the ethical conduct of research involving humans. Um, and the latest edition is the second edition, the 2022 version. Our guidance, in short, TCPS2, has three main ethical principles that run throughout it. One is that in any research, there should be, you know, respect for persons. And by respect for persons, the TCPS2 means, respect for the individual's autonomy, assuring informed consent with an emphasis on informed, voluntary participation, which also entails the right to withdraw, and that privacy and confidentiality are always taken into account in research. The concern for welfare of participants. And what this means is the physical, mental, spiritual well-being of participants, the physical, social, and economic well-being of participants, and the quality of a person's experiences within any research. Justice, which is becoming much more a key theme and is being emphasized now even more in Tri-Council funding. Um, you know, this would deal with issues of fairness and equity when we are talking about who is included for participation in a study. There's been a lot of historical uh, exclusion, particularly in things like medical research. Most of the cardiac research was done on white men of a certain age. What they've discovered is that this doesn't always apply to groups outside of that, certainly not to women. So a lot of that research has had to be redone, particularly like drug clinical trial research with different drugs, because they find that it doesn't actually work the same way. So when you're, picking one of the things the REB will sort of look at in terms of justice is what's the basis of the selection of your study participants? Are you being inclusive? And this is something, that we are seeing a lot. We have a demographic at the U of R that is quite varied. Um, and it's good to include consideration of that in the inclusion criteria for participation in a research project, because the REB will ask about that. Um, just so you know, REBs also are mandated to assure compliance with provincial, national, and international regulations. Um, in Canada, this means the two federal privacy laws must be adhered to, the Privacy Act and the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, PIPEDA for short. Locally, this is also like provincially, this is the Local Authority Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act and the Saskatchewan Health Information Protection Act. This would also include things like Health Canada regulations. So, please note that we do look at whether you'd be in compliance with all these regulations. What does the REB have purview over? The following requires research ethics review and approval by an REB before the research commences. Research involving living human participants, research involving human biological materials, as well as human embryos, fetuses, fetal tissue, reproductive materials, and stem cells. And it's applicable to materials derived from living and deceased individuals. Research utilizing retrospective or prospective personal data. Research is defined by TCPS2 as an undertaking intended to extend knowledge through a disciplined inquiry or systematic investigation. There are projects that are not deemed to be research under the definition by TCPS2 that still seem to follow quite similar methodology to actual research. But it would be exempt from REB review. This includes things like quality improvement, quality assurance, or program evaluation initiatives, creative endeavors, which has become a big challenge for the REB. When that creative line is crossed into research data collection. So it's a bit of a navigation to determine when something falls under research and when it would be exempt. Uh, Observational studies or studies that are using publicly available data would be exempt from REB review as long as there's no distinct, identification of specific individuals or um, under observational data, like you wouldn't want to be recording conversations people are having, even if it's in a public place without permission. Um, right now, because we've run into some issues with past exemptions that with extensive back and forth clarifying what's exactly going to happen, we are asking for submissions of an RUB application in order for us to issue an exemption letter. This is just to assure that it actually is exempt and that any questions are documented and we've got records of that. We've just had some problems with that, but also sometimes with the back and forth, it gets very confusing if it's not done in a structured way for researchers. We've got 4 different application types. We've amalgamated the behavioral and the biomedical application forms into a standard application form. There's a faculty and a student version. Please be sure if it is a student project that you use the student application form. Those are fast tracked. So you want to make sure you're using the correct form, please. Um, things to consider, we're going to talk a little bit more about these are things like recruitment, the consent form process and the consent process, data security. There's a secondary use of data form. If you have identifiers, direct or potential, then, please note the research would not be anonymous. There's a pet peeve of mine. Everyone's always like, it's anonymous data. And it's like, there's a link somewhere to people's identities. It's not anonymous, right? So that would be maybe de-identified as opposed to anonymous, please. There's a course-based research application form. We're in the process of trying to revise our course-based research process, just to assure that projects that are reviewed under that application, which is a very simple application form, sort of falls in line with what might be acceptable for learners to be doing for research projects for a course. That's still, I think it's going to actually be determined how that process looks in the next year or so, I hope. We also have a approved by another institution form. This is in the 2022 version of the TCPS2. Some of the language around multi-jurisdictional research has changed. So it really has made doing research nationally I think a lot easier for our researchers, but also to do collaborations with, um, principal investigators from other institutions where an REB has already been received. It makes it much simpler. You do need to submit the approved by another institution form. It's a delegated review. It's usually very quick. You do need to make sure you submit all relevant documents from the REB of record. That's the REB that initially reviewed and where the research is being initiated to start, and the principal investigator has their affiliation. So what I mean by relevant documents is the application, the notices of ethical review, the approval, all of the accompanying documentation like recruitment material, consent forms, data variable lists, anything like that you was submitted and approved by the other REB needs to be submitted for review, please. Okay, so I want to just preface this with a really, really loose metaphor because I don't want anyone getting offended or anything. I definitely do not mean it in any kind of direct reference way. But, you know, one of the things we've really noticed, and one of the things that I certainly notice on a day-to-day basis in terms of delays in reviews is, perhaps people are not quite as ready for submission as they think they are. And this can become a huge problem. And so I'm just going to tell you a little story because this is kind of sometimes when we get applications, it's like, oh dear. But, when I was 8 or 9, I decided, I was going to do a puppet show and I was super excited and I thought about it a lot and I had the best plan ever. Like, when I talked about it, when I thought about it, when I wrote about it, it was going to be a brilliant, brilliant puppet show. And the audience was going to be wowed. And I made the mistake of talking about it profusely in school and telling everyone that they could come and see the puppet show. And, I was going to charge 5 cents because somebody asked me if I was going to charge them. And I thought, oh, so I said I was going to charge 5 cents, only 5 cents to come see this brilliant, amazing puppet show. And I talked about it so much that one day my whole class said they were coming. Everyone was going to come for the puppet show. Unfortunately, I didn't have the puppets. I didn't have any costumes. I didn't have any script, right? I had like a loose story in my head, but that was about it. And my whole class followed me home, you know. I was scrambling inside my house while they all sat in the backyard trying to figure out what I was going to do. I would just like to say it led to my social downfall and, the stigma of that, stayed with me for years and years. So when you're doing research, there's things you should know and things, you essentially should be ready to, if we stay with the metaphor, to be on, right? Everything should be prepared by the time you're submitting an REB application, right? The plan should be secure. You've got all of the kinds of documents you're going to require. And if you submit too early, that review process is going to get extended and it's going to be painful. So, we there's some things you can do, you want to think about, do you have the required or recommended training? We do require all our researchers to have the Tri-Council Policy Statement tutorial certification. That's TCPS 2 2022, um, the core training. Marie, if you can pop in the link for that training in the chat, that would be appreciated, please. We also have available if you're doing research with Indigenous communities, FNU has the Indigenous research level of engagement training that's available for free. It's really worth taking, take a look. We also have the BRIC training that is available for a fee. We do from time to time offer sessions. We have in the last couple of years here. Run through the VPR's office. And usually a call will go out if we have openings for those sessions. So, keep a lookout for that. BRIC training, by the way, is building research relationships with Indigenous communities. And it's really great because it is people that know the Saskatchewan context really well that do those workshops, but also have created the training that if you do it online. There's also the OCAP training, if you're working with First Nations groups, but also, even Métis populations, it's something to keep in mind. And Marie, if you can pop in the OCAP training link as well. If the research is happening in specific communities, you want to ask yourself before you even consider submitting an application, have you done the appropriate early engagement? Do you have some form of agreement with the community on the roles and responsibilities of yourself and the community? in the research project, right? That should all be worked out prior to coming to us. If you require other approvals or letters of support, do you have those ready? Quite often, if you're going to other institutions, for example, like SHA, you would need an operational approval to do research in schools. You need school board approval. Some of those you can't get till after you have the Research Ethics Board approval. But make sure you mention that in your application then, right? So the school board approvals, SHA operational approval, you need to have the REB approval prior to um, being able to do those applications. The SHA you can apply prior once you have an REB number, but with the school board, they do want you to wait till you've got the approval to apply to their ethics committee. But from communities, you probably want those letters of, you do want those letters of support before you submit an application. We do need to see that that engagement has occurred. Do you have all your study documents prepared? Do you have all the recruitment material? That's everything like posters, email scripts if you're recruiting via email, or if you're doing social media, do you have the script ready? Do you have your consent forms for each of the participant pools you're recruiting ready? Do you have the survey ready? And with surveys, we usually ask that our researchers use Qualtrics because the university actually it's gone through information security review, but also we our researchers have access to it through their university accounts. We'll usually ask to see the link to online surveys as well as receiving a PDF or Word copy of it for our files. And that does need to be submitted with the application. If you're doing experiments, you should have like a protocol for the study procedures. So if there's various different uh, interventions that you're doing in an experiment, make sure that you attach a protocol that outlines the actual process of when certain interventions are occurring and how, and the process for doing those. Do you have your interview or focus group guides or script ready? If you're doing oral consent, a lot of people use Zoom or Teams now to do online interviewing or focus groups. So you do need to document consent. So a consent log would actually be recording who took the consent, when, that the person consented, who that person is, that the application, the consent form was fully reviewed with them. If you are collecting different data variables in a study, then you should also provide a data variable list. If you are going to sort of de-identify data sets, I didn't put it on here, but you need something called a master list if you're going to use like codes so that participants are de-identified. So a master list would just be linking participant identity to a code if you require that. If you're using internet platforms such as Qualtrics, Zoom, or Otter AI, for example, these are ones we see commonly. Are you clear on the data security of those platforms? And can you explain the security and retention times of those platforms on your application form? Other considerations while thinking of your plan of execution of the research prior to applying. With recruitment, you should note that consent to should be sought prior to organizations or individuals sharing contact information with you. This is a common one we usually see. People are like, oh, we're going to do snowball sampling, and people will just give us the contact information for people that they think would be interested, or the organization will give us a bunch of contacts for people. Anyone sharing anything like that with you has to get consent from the individuals prior to sharing any kind of contact information with you. So please be sure you account for that. Do you have a secure way of sharing data amongst the study team? We actually just had in the research department a session with um, uh, people from information security on this. So information security is recommending setting up a Teams group to share data. It's a much better way to do it, and especially if you're collaborating on things like analysis. So, please make sure you're putting those considerations into how you are retaining data, how you're securing it in the application form. Make sure you have a strong data security process in place. Have you considered all the risks to potential participants? Even if, you think, oh, this is pretty minor, privacy is always an issue when you're doing research. But there could be other risks, even if let's say your research is on housing and you're asking people about different challenges with housing in Canada. Well, you could potentially end up opening up, all kinds of traumatic events for people. So you want to always consider the potential risks, not just what is really apparent, right? When you are filling in the risk section of the application, and you always want to account for that in the consent form and have some sort of mitigation strategies for risks in your application in the consent form, please. Um, you know, Things to think of when you're trying to determine if your consent process is informed. Are you clear on the purpose of the study and time commitment? And have you listed all the members of the study that will interact with participants or have access to their data on the application, on the consent form? Are you using appropriate language level to assure your participants understand the purpose and procedures of the study? This is a pet peeve of the myself and the REB members and the chairs. There's a difference even when you're recruiting within academia. There's a difference in how we read consent forms and how we would read a, you know, biology textbook. It's best to keep language simple. Don't assume knowledge of, really specific terminology. Always define things. Don't use acronyms that wouldn't be known by everyone and especially your participant pool. So, really simplify the language in the consent form to be sure that there's a clear understanding of what's being expected, what the procedures will be, what the purpose of the study is. Have you clearly explained the voluntariness of consent and the ability to withdraw from the study to participants? And this can include things like the limitations on withdrawal. So, in focus groups, it can be difficult to withdraw. If you have an anonymous survey, it's impossible to withdraw people because you don't know who filled in the survey. If you're not collecting any identifiers with the survey. Um, Make sure you account for all of that in the application. Have you clearly explained how you'll protect the participants' confidentiality? Have you explained how the data will be used and for how long? Do you have a plan of sharing the results of the study with participants that's clearly stated? And this is a big one. You really should do that if you are asking participants to take their time to participate in a study. There should be some manner of sharing results with participants included, and that information should be included in the consent form. You should provide at least 72 hours to consider participation in a study from the time that somebody's seeing the recruitment material till they can decide if they're going to participate or not. Be realistic on whether time commitments that are required for a study are feasible for most participants. We've had a lot lately coming in, particularly with student projects, where the time commitment is really extensive. Well, that's not a purely ethical concern. It does become a concern when you're asking participants to spend a significant amount of time with, perhaps not a clear benefit to them. So please build that in, right? The considerations, especially for student projects where there's such a short timeline. Um, you know, make sure you are considering whether something's really doable. Um, Consider whether your research is asking for sensitive questions or working with vulnerable populations. And, make sure you build in um, mitigation strategies for risks into your whole research design, but also into all of the participant-facing materials, so that you're taking it into, account how different populations might be affected by research. Please make sure you're using culturally appropriate language, but also processes, and that you take into account the consideration of the values and customs of others. Um, you know, Particularly within a university context, if your faculty recruiting students, please be aware and account for in your application and recruitment process that, you want to make sure there's not a perception of coercion or undue influence to participate. So just build that into your research design. Um, some tips for student research applications. Please, and this is now a requirement, we're actually going in and changing it. And this was actually from a lot of people coming back, a lot of faculty coming back. Unfortunately on Converis, the ability of faculty to submit extensive comments upon review of a student application. In the supervisor's role, you kind of get a pop-up box and that's it. It's not a great way to leave comments. So, you know, researchers have asked us this, faculty has asked us this, but also we have had some pushback from other institutions that require faculty or the supervisor to be the principal investigator. So to be consistent with our sister universities with whom we have a reciprocity agreement, blah, blah, blah. What am I just saying there? Our sister REBs that we have a reciprocity agreement with in the province, that's SHA and USask REBs. We are now going to require that the supervisor be listed as a PI with the student on student applications, please. Please make sure that you use our consent form templates. Be sure to include all required documents. We're getting a lot of student applications submitted where there's no recruitment material, there's no consent form, the plan is not really worked out, and we want to be mindful. We don't want the application process with the REB to be a negative experience for students. REB applications are never fun, but they shouldn't be so onerous that people never want to do human research again, right? So, you know, I think that's something the supervisors can also really assist with is really double checking prior to moving applications forward for review. Please note only the supervisor can move a study forward to review at each stage of review. The student can only move it back to the supervisor. Um, please make sure, as I said earlier, use the student application form. Those are fast-tracked. Please note that the supervisor has to be responsible for the data retention for the full life cycle of the project. This is to assure once a student has completed their university degree, that if participant complaints or anything like that come in, the REB can follow up. And all of the information would be with the supervisor. Please note the quality of an application will determine if the review is onerous or not. If this is your first application, set up an appointment with me, as we can assist in making the process easier. Always good, just send me a proposal and we can schedule a time and I can give you some recommendations on things to consider prior to starting the REB process. For course-based research, please note that we are requiring all students that are going to be doing course-based research that involves research with human beings, they will need the TCPS2 tutorial certification. It's required. Um, Please use the risk assessment checklist for student coursework research. We will have that on the website shortly. I'm going to go through it in a minute. Submit the class syllabus, assignment, the sample survey or interview questions, recruitment and consent form templates. We have some draft course-based consent form and recruitment templates available. They're still sort of being run by different stakeholders in the university community. So hopefully we'll have those up for you soon too. The course-based risk assessment checklist, essentially it asks students to check that projects are no more than minimal risk to participants, that research participants will be drawn from the general adult population capable of giving free and informed consent and will not include vulnerable participants, such as children, persons who are not legally competent to consent, mentally incompetent persons, legal wards, or persons dependent upon the researchers for therapeutic care, or those who are marginalized. The projects will not involve any personal, sensitive, or incriminating topics or questions, which could place participants at risk. And I think this is, just especially with, people who are just learning research methodology for the first time, it's important. The projects will not change or involve behaviors of participants beyond the range of normal daily life. The projects will not involve physically invasive contact with the research participants, for example, taking blood or urine samples, cortisol, muscle biopsies, tissue for genetic testing. The projects will not involve deception. Um, that one, maybe we need to consider, sometimes you can have uh, some studies in psychology where the total purpose of the study might not be shared, but there would always be a way to alleviate that. We haven't really seen any course-based research like that, but certainly that could be up for a discussion if researchers or faculty feel that that would be important for students to learn. Okay, I thought this would be shorter than it is, and I've blabbed for a really long time here. Um, This is important, compensation and participant eligibility. The REB's been hearing about participants who do not meet the eligibility criteria. And there's issues then with, people seem to have said that they do meet the eligibility, but then there's indications that these people actually don't meet the eligibility criteria and that they perhaps have agreed to be in the study for the compensation. So, consider building in a way to assess eligibility if you're offering compensation. Finance has requirements for reporting on funded studies. It's a document called Procedures for Cash and Cash Equivalents, and it's available on that link on this page. There's also a early release of funds is available for funded research if you require for non-participant related activities. That goes through me, and you should copy any of the grants facilitators that are working with you on a specific grant on that email when you submit it. I'm going to skip over some of these. There's a whole bunch of information here on timelines. Please make sure you go through this. This is for minimal risk studies and above minimal risk. It provides timelines. I should have in there working days for all of those timelines. So we'll correct that before it's available as a PDF. Continuing review, really, really important. REB approvals are only valid for 1 year from the date of the approval. A fully filled out renewal form must be submitted prior to the expiry of the approval. Any changes to the study design or participant recruitment or consent processes have to be submitted via an amendment form, and all of the accompanying documents that require changing out should be submitted in track changes, please. There's a lot of delays in amendment review if these are not if all the information is not submitted together with the amendment form, please. Um, Please note that we also need to be notified of changes to the research team members. And if consent forms and recruitment material needs to be updated, those should be submitted and track changes as well to reflect those changes, please. Okay. How can we assist you? We're available for pre-submission discussion and discussion after review. Just get in touch with me and we can set that up with the chairs if you require. We can recommend strategies for improving your application prior to starting the process. Send us the proposals and I can provide you information. For community engagement research, we do have 2 research engagement managers under the VPR's office that can assist with international, national, and provincial community engagement recommendations. Their email is there. We can also facilitate, as I said, the early release of funds for projects requiring REB submission. And we can assist with information on requirements to conduct research in Saskatchewan. Please note that there is a full reciprocity agreement with the USask and SHA, so you do not need to submit REB approvals to those institutions once you have our approval, and vice versa as well if you're a collaborator on other projects. But please get in touch with me if you are collaborating on another project. You may want to let us know anyway, just so we have that documented somewhere. Okay, so we're gonna actually bring in Cassandra now, who's gonna be like, I've got 5 minutes, Gogo. What have you done to me?
Hey,
Cassandra,
so
are you there?
as a reminder, Gogo, you told me not to prepare anything, so I didn't.
I did,
Also,
but
this is also exactly what happened the last time we presented together. Do you remember?
we were both like, but Cassandra and I ended up presenting in a class together, and I was like, Cassandra, I love the insights you had because you shared some of your challenges.
Mhm.
Um, because let's be honest, I don't know if an REB review, other than a recent one that one of Justin Longo, who's with us today, students submitted, where there haven't been some challenges when you get comments back, right? So how did you deal with that? And what would you recommend to people when they're going through that process?
Um, well, and I say this with love because I was on the REB for a while, and I think it was really useful for me to be on there and to kind of see the other side of it. Because prior to that, my experience had been just I'd never submitted an ethics application before, and I got really frustrated with the comments that I got back. But then it was understanding the process and learning why those things are there. I think there's still things that the REB, like, figuring out, there's some stuff that feels repetitive. I think even you and I were going over a course-based application the other day for my own class. And I was kind of like, but I already said that in the other section. So it's like those things can be frustrating. So I think um, my biggest piece of advice is that if it feels repetitive, you're probably on the right track. Like just making sure you have that information in there, it just really clarifies things for them. The other thing is, I think, don't make assumptions. The biggest thing that I thought was really interesting was that when I was doing my dissertation, the folks that I interviewed were not identified as an at-risk population at all. These were all professionals in their field. And so I didn't identify them as needing anything that I needed to be concerned about. And my application got kicked back because the comment was, you can't assume that certain things aren't going to be possibly triggering for folks, especially given the themes that I was doing in my work, which were dealing with pretty extreme cases of mental illness. So I took that and I added uh, in mental health. I made a little list of mental health resources, things that would be a little bit more generally available because I was interviewing folks across the country. And it was a little embarrassing reading to like one of the top psychiatrists in the country about the mental health resources that were available to them at the end of my interview. They kind of chuckled and they're like, no, it's good you included that. But as it turned out with a couple of the other folks that I interviewed, it ended up leading to an interesting conversation about having resources in place and why that's important. And that I had reminded them to book with counselors that they already had and things like that. So yeah, I think for me, that's the thing that you and I talked about when I think I also presented for 3 minutes the last time we got together. But that was the big thing I
I was
highlighted then.
trying so hard not to be verbose. I don't know what
Oh, it's
happened.
good. I honestly, I overall, I think those were the big things that came up for me was learning to just make sure I was repeating and clarifying the material, and then also being really clear about not making assumptions, and that ended up being useful. And chatting with my students in Social Studies 307 this term, where we were talking about um, you know, what constitutes risk, right? And you could be interviewing university students about their, economic hardships, which is what we're talking about. And as we know, there can be a very, very strong connection between economic stress and mental illness disorder, right? Disruptions. So you never really know what could be triggering for somebody. So it's kind of a little bit more of that, the better safe than sorry. Even if somebody kind of chuckles, it's better that you have those resources available. So I think that was the big thing for me, was just not making those assumptions and being aware, and not necessarily just thinking that it's only high risk communities that we need to be caring for after we engage with them with research.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that I don't know if you sort of experienced that when you went through the process. I think sometimes when the REB makes a recommendation, um, if there's a rationale for why you don't want to do something, or don't want to follow the recommendation, uh, you know, provide the rationale. Like,
Right. Yeah.
right? Like it's if we're recommending something, if the chairs are recommending something, usually if the rationale for something is explained and if there's any kind of risk, you've mitigated for it.
Yeah.
Um, you know, there's an understanding of that, right?
Yeah. And I actually, when I resubmitted my personal REB application, I did it very much the same way I would respond to reader comments on a journal article. I made a little chart in Word. I had what the comments were from the REB, how specifically I was addressing it, or if I no, I'm not doing that, and here's why. So yeah, I found that that made it a lot easier, and I felt that that meant the second round was a lot faster, because then the reviewers who had a second look at my application could see very quickly what I was addressing and why. I didn't have to go back through the whole application again, which really sped up the process as well. And allowed me to really put in the rationales as I needed to in a clear way. So that's more like an organizational thing, but that really helped my brain as well.
Yeah, yeah. Which now, like you received a NER document.
Okay, well, yeah, I haven't done
So
one since
the
then.
process a little bit different on Converse, yeah.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, I'm using Converse for the first time now with the course based, which is yeah, it's pretty slick. I think I told you I had a personal complaint. It didn't save any of my entries the other night, but I powered through.
I know I was like, I don't know.
No,
We'd have
I
to.
don't think you're personally responsible for Converse working, but yeah.
No, thank goodness not. Um, I thought maybe we'd open it up for
I was gonna
questions
say, yeah.
because people may have questions that are more applicable to like that you might have a better response to than I would, even from a researcher's perspective. Does anyone have any questions or comments even, or points of discussion you'd like to address?
Gogo, I'd like to ask a question and ask this, going to sound really naive, but when does talking to people not amount to something that requires research ethics? So if I'm been asked to write a blog post about something, and in order to give it some depth, I want to talk to three senior government officials on their perspectives. Is that research that requires human research ethics approval?
It depends. Like it's a blog, so it's going to be out there. I'm assuming you're going to name who these people are.
Yep,
You're going to, right?
yep.
Um, so it's like out in the public. Like, is it publicly available or is it like on some select blog? I don't know. You guys, I don't know anything about blogs. I don't know. Are they publicly available?
Yes, they are
Uh,
web pages.
Yeah. So usually if it's like something that overt, and it's not really, you're not using it for any other purposes, then I don't know, it's a blog on current events or something or
Yeah,
business practices,
yeah.
right? The purpose is what's going to determine if it falls into that research category or not, right? Like, why are you doing it? How is that data going to be used?
I mean, it's part of being I'm sorry to use such a grandiose term, part of being a public intellectual, to contributing to the public discourse around issues. And so if I want to say something about something that's happening with respect to technology and governance, and I think it's going to be enhanced by getting the perspectives of a couple of people who are actually doing this stuff, is that research that requires human research ethics approval.
Yeah, this is a tricky one. We also have had like a lot of people doing podcasts.
Yep. Yep.
Um, and I think it would really be what is the purpose of that, right? Like we're being, I'm assuming faculty are being encouraged to have those kinds of
Yep.
public discussions, right?
Some criteria documents have, if not explicitly, implicitly identify that kind of activity as part of research and social public engagement.
Yeah, and I mean, if it's like, I guess the purpose of it would really determine it, right? So we've had some where it's like knowledge dissemination, and those don't necessarily fall in our purview, depending on what they're doing and
Hmm.
what they're collecting or who they're approaching. Um, I don't know if I could give you a totally clear-cut answer that would address like, go ahead, everyone, blog. You know what I mean? Without asking. I think it would depend on what you're doing with it, what the purpose for it
If
is.
I can interject here, Gogo, and this is maybe just for some consideration, like for my dissertation, I wasn't interviewing a big group of folks. I was specifically identifying people who were case study experts or subject matter experts or people who were professionals in their field. So I was still required to do an REB to interview them. Um, I don't know if it was because it was due to the academic work or what have you, but a couple of them chose to stay anonymous. And so there was potentially the possibility that maybe due to the sensitivity of the case that I was doing the case study on. But the majority of them who were already public speakers or figures, one who
Wanted to be
said
known.
was like a
Yeah.
well-known psychiatrist, one who was like a national renowned journalist. These are people who already had public profiles who chose not to be anonymous. I don't know. To me, it's if it's utilizing the input for a blog post, a public blog post from people who are already public officials. Um, I think that might fall outside, but my time on the REB was limited, so that's why I'm
Yeah.
bringing
Yeah.
up.
And I have to say we have been struggling with these. I did see Kim is on there, the chair. I don't know if Jen is on there too. I don't think so. Kim, are you there? Jen, you are too. I see.
I am. I've
Because
been avoiding
she's like, I'm
surprisingly
not coming
difficult.
on. I don't want to talk about that one.
I you kind of go down a rabbit hole. It's like, oh my God, what? Where do you draw the line? It's really not easy. I mean, some of the I think it is case by case basis. There's no like blanket statement that can cover everything. One like guideline I saw that was kind of helpful was using a person as a resource, tell me about the history of this building is treated differently than tell me about your personal experience. That was something that kind of helped determine, but yeah, it is quite tricky.
Yeah. And even the purpose can be tricky sometimes, right? Like, because a lot of times uses that are not really don't fall under that definition of research can look a lot like research. So,
Another
it,
comment,
yeah.
Gogo, is that we did have this conversation, and I don't know if we came up with an answer or not, but it's kind of the same thing in journalism. Whether or not that's considered research, and I think we need to, it's a really good question, Justin, because I think we need to dig into that a little bit more with what um, the School of Journalism does.
Yeah, and from my perspective as a School of Public Policy, I think it's right. It probably does belong as an agenda item on a future board meeting
Yeah.
uh, to get some clarity. and be able to provide that clarity to researchers, because the way it's sounding right now, it's kind of like it leaves it up to the researcher to think, it doesn't sound like research to me, so I'm going to go ahead and do it without ethics approval, and then that sets up a dilemma. So providing, and I know we're not going to be able to provide absolute clarity, but better guidance, I think, would be
Yeah.
helpful. And I think that should come from the board level.
And I think that it will become more of a common thing because, you know, but it's being encouraged, right? Because it is the way
Yeah,
people
exactly.
are accessing information now.
And in my field, writing blog posts is not seen as by any means time wasting. It is seen as part of the contribution to public discourse. It's a different method than peer-reviewed journals, but it's not dismissed as being irrelevant.
Well, Justin, we want you to no, we do need to bring that to a discussion and we should have some guidelines around it. We'll have to take a look at what's available out there too.
All right, thanks.
Anybody else? No? Okay, well, if you think of any questions, please reach out. We are always available for a discussion. And, please, if there's any takeaway from here, it's, come see us early. We're here to help. We can, make recommendations on how to approach things prior to the REB application. We really don't want it to be difficult for people. And we do kind of know the things that get flagged all the time. Somebody's got their hand up. Justin?
Yeah, I'll just reiterate that that's really good advice, because in this last round, I went through a consultation with Gogo, and my student really made that process go much more smoothly. So just that initial conversation was super helpful. So I'd recommend to anybody, if you do feel kind of ambiguous or ambivalent about the thing, just try to reach out to the research ethics office, and that'll be really helpful to help get you on the right track.
Oh, a little bit of kudos for the office there. Thank you. I really want to thank Cassandra. Cassandra, thanks for sitting through 55 minutes of REB. Really appreciate your joining. And thank you all for coming.
Thanks, Gogo. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, everybody.